Welcome to episode 3 of Alpha Whisperers Genesis, where we explore the hidden world of the quiet power behind the power, the unseen dynamics shaping leadership and decision-making at the highest levels of business, government, and beyond. I'm Dr. Laura Sicola.
And I'm Janet C. Salazar, creator of the Alpha Whisperers brand. Today in episode 3, we're diving into the question, what's ego got to do with it?
Yes.
We'll look at how ego plays a role in both alphas, the leaders, and their whisperers, the advisors who guide them.
That's right. We're going to unpack the differences between the alpha's ego and the whisperer's ego, understanding how each shapes their actions, their interactions, and ultimately their influence. We'll also look at how ego, when kept in balance, can strengthen leadership.
And when left unchecked, can lead to major challenges. Okay, Laura, let's get started.
All right, so let's start with the alphas. What role does ego play for them?
Well, ego fuels the alpha's vision and authority. Ego projects confidence, and their confidence often defines their identity as a leader.
Well, and that makes sense because, who wants to follow a leader who doesn't seem confident in where they want to go?
Exactly, Laura. Ego also facilitates decision-making.
Okay, how?
It makes the alpha decisive in challenging situations, and it helps them set goals and rally support. It's also important for responsibility and accountability because alpha's identities is inherently tied to the success or failure of their organizations, which is good, right?
Sure.
Because it makes them take ownership of their decision and it fosters resilience, but it can also lead to stress under high-stakes pressure.
And not all leaders are necessarily as good at handling stress, perhaps.
That's correct, Laura.
Okay.
So at the same time, we have to be careful because an overinflated ego can sometimes lead alphas to dismiss feedback or any other alternative perspectives, even from their whisperers.
Okay, so we want to make sure we've got that balance. So egos are necessary for quick decision-making, being decisive, and having that ownership, that responsibility, the accountability, which is what we've mentioned in episode 1, that is really urgent in the best leaders.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's shift to the whisperer's ego. So Janet, what does an ego look like for an alpha whisperer?
Well, this is, I guess, the most interesting part of our conversation here, Laura, because so many other people think that just because whisperers are operating from behind the scene, they think that whisperers don't have egos, but they do.
They're human.
They're human, exactly, and
Yes.
we all have egos, right? But it's a different kind of ego because it is part of that element of being in a supportive role for their alphas, with the goal of empowering the alpha, not outshining them.
Okay, major difference there between the two.
Exactly. Yeah. So their ego is focused on supporting the alpha's vision rather than asserting their own authority.
Well, they don't really have any last time I checked. They're the advisor only.
Exactly, right? That's why
Right.
they are behind the scene. The alpha whisperer's ego is tied to the magnitude of the impact of their advice.
Okay, wait, say that again because that was a big mouthful and I think there's a lot in there. I want to make sure we unpack it. Say that again.
The alpha whisperer's ego is tied to the magnitude of the impact of their advice.
So the alpha whisperer is watching to see, all right, if you, my alpha, you take my advice, you make this decision, you sign these papers, we make these changes, how does it land? What is the effect of it? Is it good or bad? And how big is it? And the more positive, the more successful your decision is based on my advice, that's where my ego gets most fed.
Exactly. And with that, it actually fosters a collaborative approach with the alpha.
Sure, because your success is my success and my success is your success. We work together really well that way. Okay.
Exactly. So confidence in their own value is primarily internal, when you look at it that way. So it comes from within, right? Because they can never have recognition or authority.
At least not too publicly. Right.
Exactly. Not too publicly. Exactly.
So let's look deeper at those decision-making dynamics. How does ego shape how they approach decisions?
Alphas are, as we know, decisive, often driven by personal conviction and strong sense of self. I can identify with that.
I think most of us can.
Exactly, right? Whereas the whisperers foster discussion and guide the alpha's thought process. The whisperers value having input over final decision-making authority.
The ultimate outcome is not theirs to make. So the currency that they work in is the ability to have the input toward that decision.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Now, all leaders have an issue, all people have an issue with feedback. We have to give it, we have to receive it. How do alphas and whisperers handle feedback?
Well, because alphas, again, have these very strong personalities, right? Alphas are more likely or have that tendency to react defensively to criticisms because, again, their identity is linked to their decisions, right?
Yes.
So a lot of times it almost becomes personal for them.
Yes.
Because these things are linked together.
Sure. Well, it reminds me of in sports. They say players win, coaches lose. So if the team does well, hey, celebrate all these wonderful players who are on the team. But if the team loses, it's the coach who gets axed.
Exactly. That's exactly, yeah.
It's they make the wrong call.
Yes.
They have the wrong strategy. It was their fault. So the buck stops with them in the end.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why a very important key leadership skill for the alphas would be the ability to receive feedback gracefully,
Right.
tactfully,
Yes.
and
Being open to it in general.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at whisperers then.
Whispers are actually more open to feedback, Laura, because they're focused on refining their counsel and aligning it with the alpha's needs. So they're more focused on for example, the decision at hand that needs to be done.
So it sounds like they are more attuned to figuring out, okay, what does the boss need? What does the
Yes.
boss want?
Yes.
How can I get through to the boss? It's my job to adapt my approach to meet with them. Ideally, it would be two-way, but if one person has to flex more, it's going to be the whisperer and who's going to take that feedback to be able to be more effective later.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why they're the whispers, right? It's almost like to the point of selflessness, really.
Interesting. Let's talk about motivation. What drives the ego of each role?
For alphas, Laura,
Yeah.
definitely ambition and recognition.
Okay.
Right, yes.
Sure.
And for the whisperers, well, at least I'm talking about the good whisperers here.
Yes. Everyone
Yeah.
has the evil twin side.
The evil twin side, right? Yeah. But, for the good whisperer, it's that desire to support the alpha's success. And of course, if it's part of an organization, then the entire organizational goals.
Yep.
But going back to what I said earlier, sometimes whisperers, actually not sometimes, most often,
Yeah.
the whisperers place the alpha's needs above their own.
So there's almost a subjugation of ego.
Exactly. Yeah. Subjugation of ego. That's the perfect term, Laura.
And that's hard because everybody's got an ego. Everybody wants to be right, wants to be heard, wants to have their advice taken. And when it's not, it can be hard to accept that.
But then again, that's what makes alpha whisperers very unique and very special.
Yes.
They're the kind of species that are able to absorb or still be very effective in giving their counsel without the need for that kind of public recognition.
Right.
Got
to have some thick skin being able to take the criticism
Exactly.
from the front.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, we've talked a little bit about why a healthy ego can be beneficial for obvious reasons, but the inflated ego can have some serious consequences. So, Janet, what are some of the dangers of the unchecked ego for both alphas and whisperers?
One of them is arrogance and disconnect.
Sure.
This can alienate team members and stakeholders. It creates a toxic environment and it hinders collaboration and innovation.
Yeah, I think we've all been victim to an arrogant leader who just won't listen and just is the my way or the highway kind of approach.
Exactly. And another thing is that resistance to feedback. When the ego is left unchecked, as we mentioned before, an inflated ego can increase the likelihood that they will be more resistant to criticism.
Yeah.
And if alphas prioritize their self-image over organizational welfare, they may make decisions for the sake of public opinion and their own status, rather than the benefit of not just the decision that they have to make, but the entire organization or their team.
Yeah, and that makes sense if all they are worried about is their own, the CYA decision making, right? The cover your assets, so to speak.
Yes. CYA.
CYA, cover your
That's
assets.
new for me. Oh, yes.
So what are we prioritizing our own well-being over the organization and the greater good? And you can certainly see where that's temptation at times and where there's a lot of fear involved. But how do we find the balance between the two? I don't have to make decisions at that level, so I suppose it's hard for me to relate on some levels, but that I imagine would be scary. So What about the whisperers then? Let's shift gears. What happens if there's an overinflated ego there?
Well, whisperers who are overly focused on their own interests may lose sight of the bigger picture. And that could lead to the misalignment with the alpha's vision. And there could be overstepping of boundaries where the whisperer can cross the line between advising and leading. It can create friction with the alpha, which is really bad. There will be a breakdown of trust. It may end up competing with the alpha and that tendency to actually attempt to take control.
Yeah.
That's ugly when that happens because those lead to sabotage and mutiny. God knows it has happened a lot into our political history. But yes, that's what happens.
Okay, so there's that gray scale, it sounds like, between when there's a healthy debate and argument and creative tensions and frictions, et cetera, and then the gray scale moves farther along, and then it's just the fighting, and if it becomes competition, if there's any sort of backroom lobbying or trying to get around the alpha, if they're overstepping their bounds, then when is that necessary? I imagine that would be hard for some whisperers to decide if it's like, well, it's necessary for me to go over I don't know if you can go over an alpha's head, but to try to work around them versus pushing through and getting them to change their mind. That would be politically challenging in any environment, business or governmental or otherwise.
Exactly.
So we don't want warring factions and all that. So we got to find a way to bring everybody together through it.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Okay, so it sounds like overall an overactive ego on the part of the whisperer erodes trust, and that leads to a toxic environment where collaboration, at the very least, is compromised.
Exactly.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Now we talked about the ugly. We talked about they talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. We hit the bad and the ugly. Let's go back to the good. Let's dig deeper into the healthy, the model whisperer's ego specifically. So, Janet, a healthy, well-grounded ego in a whisperer can enhance the leadership dynamic. How? What are the effects of the balanced whisperer's ego?
Well, the number one thing, Laura, is trust. When there is a healthy, balanced ego, it creates trust with the alpha. And that's the most important foundation of any relationship between the alpha and the whisperer.
Sure.
And so when there is then trusted relationship between the two, it enables the whisperer to be assertive, to challenge and guide or even call out the alpha because he knows that he can do that because of that trusted relationship.
In leadership communication, we talk a lot about executive presence, and we look at how to operationalize that. One of the elements that often gets referenced is the notion of being able to speak truth to power. Can you tell your boss, your client, the board, whoever it is, something that they may not want to hear, that may not make them happy? Can you stand your ground and tell them that and not be a yes man or a yes woman?
Yes.
And you can't do that if you don't have trust.
Yes, perfectly said, Laura. Going back to our discussion with a healthy ego, the whisperer can take the initiative in problem solving and present innovative ideas to the alpha and to the group in general. Because there is that open, trusted relationship, the whisperer feels that they are free to explore and have these problem-solving initiatives with their alphas. So it creates a positive environment that enhances the alpha's effectiveness and fosters an open dialogue.
Yes. You know, there's a book, and I think a lot of our listeners have probably at least heard of it, if not read it, by Pat Lencioni from a little while ago called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I highly recommend it to everybody if you haven't already read it, whether it's a business team or a nonprofit or whatever the organization is. Dysfunction number one was a lack of trust. And the lack of trust was at the root of the other 4 dysfunctions. You can work on any of them, but none of them will be successful in the transformation and improvement if you don't have that trust first. So I think this is all really tying it, bringing everything full circle and underlying the importance of having trust in that leadership relationship.
Absolutely.
So with that, Janet, we have hit a whole bunch of amazing information with regard to the role of ego, good, the bad, and the ugly, in that alpha whisper relationship, its benefits, its dangers. And I'd like to do a call to action to everybody out there who's listening. So as you finish listening to our conversation, I invite you to consider how ego shapes your own interactions, your own motivations. Are you an alpha who takes pride in leading? Are you a whisperer who's committed to supporting? Maybe a little bit of both. I think most of us are in different contexts, one or the other, or both at different times. So in those different contexts, ask yourself, how does your ego serve your role? And where might it need to be tempered for better results? So Janet, any final thoughts today?
Just wanted to really emphasize the importance of mutual trust between the alpha and the whisperer. That is basically the foundation of this relationship if we want to make that dynamic work and achieve a very good decision-making process. Also, that the whisperers are not to be the yes man or the yes woman. That is not the meaning of having this trusted relationship. And then, of course, the importance of being willing and able to speak truth to power, which you perfectly articulated earlier, Laura, during our discussion. So these are my 3 key thoughts that I think I wanted to drive to our listeners and the audience out there.
Amazing. So everybody out there, listen and listen again for that matter. But then I encourage you, if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the podcast, rate the podcast, and share the podcast with others. And then share your reflections on ego in leadership with us. We would love to hear your thoughts. Janet, where can people go to learn more?
They can go to alphawhisperer.com. They can find us on LinkedIn, find us on Instagram, find us on X, and of course, YouTube. And you can find me as well on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X.
And we're both on those platforms. And we ask you that if you do reach out to us, let us know that you heard us here on the Alpha Whispers podcast. Thanks for tuning in once again to explore the power behind the power. I'm Dr. Laura Sicola.
And I'm Janet C. Salazar.
And you're listening to Alpha Whispers Genesis.